If you're stuck near the summit of Everest, you might as well be on the moon. Those were the chilling words of Rob Hall, one of the world's most experienced Everest guides. On May 10, 1996, those words became a horrifying reality. A brutal storm trapped Hall and his team near the summit, leaving them stranded in the death zone, where the air is too thin to breathe without oxygen. By the next morning, 8 climbers were dead, and the world would never forget the tragedy. This is the story of the 1996 Everest disaster, a tale of ambition, survival, and heartbreaking loss. Mount Everest has always been the ultimate challenge for climbers. By the 1990s, commercial expeditions made it possible for amateur climbers to attempt the summit for a price. Rob Hall, the owner of Adventure Consultants, and Scott Fisher, the founder of Mountain Madness, were 2 of the most famous guides on the mountain. Both had led multiple successful expeditions, but 1996 would be different. That year, Hall and Fisher were leading separate teams, but they agreed to work together to fix ropes and share resources. The stakes were high. Hall had a perfect safety record, and Fisher was a rising star in the climbing world. But the mountain had other plans. The teams included a mix of experienced climbers and wealthy amateurs. Among them were Doug Hansen, a postal worker determined to summit after a failed attempt the previous year, Beck Weathers, a doctor with a history of eye problems, and Yasuko Namba, a Japanese climber aiming to complete the 7 summits. Also on the mountain were high-profile journalists, John Krakauer, writing for Outside Magazine, and Sandy Pittman, reporting for NBC News. The world was watching. On May 9th, the IMAX team, led by legendary climber Ed Villastours, decided to turn back due to bad weather. Hall and Fisher pressed on. Little did they know, the mountain had other plans. On May 10th, 1996, at midnight, climbers from multiple teams stepped out of their tents at Camp 4, preparing for the final push to the summit of Mount Everest. This was the moment they had trained for, the ultimate goal, standing on top of the world. The plan was clear: summit by early afternoon and descend before dark. But Everest had other plans. Right from the start, things went wrong. The route was dangerously crowded. Over 30 climbers were attempting the summit at the same time, leading to long bottlenecks at key points. The Hillary Step, a nearly vertical rock face just before the summit, became a major traffic jam. Climbers were stuck waiting in line, burning through their oxygen as they stood in the freezing cold. To make matters worse, the fixed ropes, essential for a safe ascent, hadn't been properly set up ahead of time. This caused even more delays. Every wasted minute at this altitude was a death sentence. By the time the first climbers reached the summit, it was already past 1 p.m., dangerously late. Rob Hall had a rule: turn around by 2 p.m., no exceptions. But that day, the rule was broken. Doug Hansen, one of Hall's clients, had failed to summit the year before and was determined not to fail again. Even as the weather began to shift, Hall waited for him, allowing Hansen to push forward toward the top. Meanwhile, Scott Fisher, the leader of Mountain Madness, was facing his own battle. He had been climbing without supplemental oxygen for part of the ascent, trying to conserve supplies. But Everest doesn't care about toughness. By the time Fisher finally reached the summit, he was completely exhausted. As both teams lingered near the top, a deadly storm was closing in fast, but no one knew it yet. As climbers began their descent, the sky darkened. Within minutes, everything changed. A sudden blizzard slammed into Everest, reducing visibility to 0. Winds howled at 70 miles per hour, whipping snow into the air like a sandstorm. The temperature dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, instantly freezing exposed skin. What had been a clear route down was now completely buried in fresh snow. The ropes disappeared under the ice, making it nearly impossible to find the way back to camp. Climbers were trapped in a nightmare. Rob Hall and Doug Hansen were still near the summit, far too high for rescue. Hansen, weakened and oxygen-starved, collapsed. He couldn't go any further. Hall, ever the dedicated guide, refused to leave him. He tried desperately to get Hansen to move, but it was too late. Hansen succumbed to the cold, disappearing into the storm. Hall radioed base camp for help. His voice was weak, shaking from the cold. "I'm out of oxygen. I'm frostbitten. I can't feel my hands or feet." Further down, Scott Fisher had collapsed near the balcony. His Sherpa, Lobsang Jangbu, tried to help him, but Fisher was too weak to move. "I'm done," Fisher reportedly said. "Just leave me here." Lobsang reluctantly obeyed. He had to save himself. Fisher was left alone in the snow, his body slowly shutting down. Meanwhile, Beck Weathers was in even worse shape. Earlier that day, he had lost his vision due to a condition called high-altitude retinal hemorrhage. Unable to see, he had been left behind. When the storm hit, he was declared dead. But somehow, he wasn't. Hours later, Weathers woke up, buried in snow, his body barely functioning. He was frostbitten beyond recognition, but his survival instincts kicked in. With sheer willpower, he stood up and started walking. The storm had already claimed lives, but the fight for survival wasn't over yet. The mountain was in complete chaos, but in the midst of disaster, acts of heroism emerged. One of the climbers who refused to give up was Anatoly Bukrev, a guide from Fisher's team. Unlike the others, he had climbed without oxygen, believing it would make him stronger in an emergency. That moment had arrived. While others were lost, Bukrev braved the storm and made multiple solo rescue attempts, pulling several climbers back to safety at Camp 4. His actions saved lives, but they also sparked controversy. Some criticized his decision to climb without oxygen, arguing that it made him less effective as a guide. Others saw him as a hero, risking his own life to save others. Meanwhile, Rob Hall was still alive, but barely. As the storm raged on, Hall remained stranded near the summit, frostbitten and unable to move. He radioed base camp again, his voice even weaker than before. His team listened in helplessly. There was nothing they could do. By morning, the storm had claimed 8 lives, including Rob Hall, Scott Fisher, Doug Hansen, and Yasuko Nyamba. Their bodies would remain on the mountain, frozen in time. But miraculously, Beck Weathers survived. Despite being left for dead twice, he somehow made it back to Camp 4. His face was black with frostbite, his hands were completely frozen, but he was alive. In a desperate high-risk helicopter rescue, Weathers was airlifted off Everest, becoming one of the few people in history to survive such extreme conditions. His survival came at a cost. He lost his nose, fingers, and parts of his face. But he lived to tell the story. The 1996 Everest disaster shook the world, sparking debates about commercialization, safety, and human ambition. How many more would die chasing the dream of Everest? Some climbers never made it home. Others walked away, but at a cost. Beck Weathers' survival became one of the most incredible stories of the disaster. Left for dead twice, first at the balcony and again near Camp 4, he somehow refused to die. Severely frostbitten, barely conscious, and half blind, he staggered through the snow, driven by sheer instinct. When he stumbled into camp, everyone was shocked. They had already given him up for dead. His face was black from frostbite, his hands frozen solid, but he was still alive. Days later, a daring helicopter rescue, one of the highest altitude evacuations ever attempted, saved his life. But he paid the price. Weathers lost his nose, both hands, and parts of his feet. Yet, he lived to tell the story, becoming a symbol of human resilience. Another survivor, John Krakauer, a journalist and climber on Hall's team, would later write Into Thin Air, a book that became the definitive account of the disaster. His version of events was controversial, but it brought global attention to what happened on Everest that day. The disaster led to intense debates in the climbing world. One of the biggest controversies centered on Anatoly Bukreev. Was he a hero, risking his life to save stranded climbers? Or did his decision to climb without supplemental oxygen make him a liability? Jan Krakauer's book criticized Bukreev, arguing that he should have stayed closer to his team instead of descending ahead. Bukreev, in turn, defended himself, saying that climbing without oxygen allowed him to function in extreme conditions when others could not. Neil Beidelman, another guide, had mixed feelings. He acknowledged Bukreev's bravery, but also questioned his methods. Beyond Bukreev, commercial guiding itself came under fire. Were climbers like Rob Hall and Scott Fisher too focused on getting clients to the summit, even when it was unsafe? Had Everest become a business first and a climb second? The disaster forced climbers to rethink the risks, but the demand for Everest expeditions never stopped. The personal cost of the disaster was immeasurable. Rob Hall's final radio call to his wife, Jan Arnold, was heartbreaking. As he lay freezing to death near the summit, he spoke to her one last time. "Sleep well, my sweetheart," he said. "Please don't worry too much." His last words became a haunting reminder of Everest's deadly power. After 1996, Everest changed forever. New rules were introduced: mandatory oxygen reserves, stricter turnaround times, better communication systems. Guides became more cautious, prioritizing safety over summits, at least in theory. But Everest is still as dangerous as ever. Despite all the lessons learned, climbers still die every year. The risks remain the same: altitude, weather, human error. The 1996 tragedy proved one thing: no one conquers Everest. The mountain decides who lives and who dies.